Some really scary stuff seems to be happening in our country and the wider Western world at the moment, and it's freaking people out. We seem to have lost any sense of what our core values truly are in the West. What is it that we stand for as so-called liberal democratic nations? The World War II generation is slowly leaving us. If you were born after 1933, you're now in your 90s. The elders are now the boomers, a generation who grew up in mainly boom economic times. They were in their teens and 20s during the sexual revolution and the hippie 60s, a time when the young questioned everything old, challenged all the established norms and authorities and traditions, and a lot did need to change. A bit of a shake-up was necessary. But 60 years on, and a hugely permissive and so-called progressive society, the question has got to be asked, did we throw the baby out with the bathwater a bit? As a Gen Xer who grew up in the affluent 80s, I was exposed to many left-wing philosophical ideas. A very, very simplistic worldview. Capitalism was bad, money was evil, the rich could be blamed for almost everything, and the most dangerous idea of all, the government was good and kind and would take care of everything if we just taxed the rich and redistributed the wealth. That left-wing view was kind of great. It saved me a lot of difficult thinking and hard work. It simplified the world for me into the bad rich people and the good poor people, the oppressed and the oppressors, as the socialists like to pretend. And it made my lack of personal success and struggle not only acceptable, but a badge of honor in a way. I had no idea that I'd actually been subjected to a lot of brainwashing at university. I accepted full responsibility for my decisions, but I had bought into the Marxist lefty narrative hook, line and sinker. All the artsy kids did. It was cool. It wasn't until much later in life when journalism and working in the corporate world forced me to face some facts. Other people had other ideas. Rich people weren't always mean and nasty. They were often nice and smart and very hardworking and conscientious. Corporations often did a lot of good. Capitalism was a really efficient way of getting things done in the most fair way possible. And not all left-wing people or poor people were nice and kind victims. Many brought many of their problems on themselves. And some of the biggest whingers and downers at work were the people who perpetually claimed some kind of victimhood or bad treatment. Now, I guess to most people this was just obvious growing up, but I was a slow learner. At the start of this century, I moved to Asia for work. I had a big corporate regional job and travelled all over the place. I realised that the countries that were functional and richer and worked the best had more free people and free markets and capitalism and were less corruptible. And the countries that were the most dysfunctional had less freedom, less free markets and more corruption. The main difference between the two was the size and degree of meddling of government. The more government involvement, the more waste, inefficiency, corruption and mess would result. The smaller the government and the bigger the private enterprise system was, the more wealth there was for everyone. Of course, nobody had a perfect system and the systems were mixed in many places. But generally, the smaller and less intrusive the government was, the better the outcomes. Then I came home after almost 20 years away, and just as Australia was entering the COVID crisis. And I saw a country with a lot of freedom, willingly giving it up to big government interventions and intrusions, without batting an eyelid, with almost no complaint. And when some people did complain, they were shut down, mostly by other Aussies, in the form of mass social ridicule and mockery and direct dobbing, and ultimately in the form of some of the worst police overreach ever seen in Australia's history.
Down the ground! Down the ground!
Oh! The police line surrounding the shrine grew gradually tighter, with occasional forays into the crowd to pick out protesters for arrest. Many of the marchers are union members, angry at having to choose between a jab and their job. Others are venting frustration after more than 230 days of lockdown in Victoria and with weeks more to come. Victoria is something of a paradox. It's one of the most progressive states in the country and has been ruled by Labor governments for 18 of the past 22 years.
That's ABC News. They think it's a paradox that a Labor government would become authoritarian and use brutal police force. Did they miss the 20th century or something? This was not the Australia that I left in 2001. Something big had changed. The kids weren't fighting the establishment anymore. They were the establishment. They didn't hate authority and government and resist it. Now it was cool to embrace government and do its bidding, mocking any fellow citizens who even dared to question the scientific modelling and super simplistic blanket shut everything down approach of our very silly state governments and administrators. So all that nice and kind sounding harmless stuff that I've been taught at uni in the 80s by hippie lecturers from the 60s about the left wasn't harmless after all. I began researching where it all came from and found that nothing was accidental. There was an academic school of thought in Europe in the early 1920s where all this began. This group, known as the Frankfurt School, was a bunch of social scientists and researchers who were focused on the application of Marxism to philosophy and society. They started in the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Their work led to the development of a thing called critical theory, which is a Marxist worldview that wrongly sees everything through the lens of oppression and oppressors. And it's had a massive influence on the social sciences right up until today. Because of World War II, the Frankfurt School academics spread all over the world, and so did their dangerous ideas, right through America and Europe and the West, particularly in the 1960s and again in the early 2000s. Now, it's the thinking behind the idea that government has some role to play in making life equal. The problem is that as soon as you appoint a small group of elites in government to make everything equal, they become the new elites and start to do awful things. We saw this right through the 20th century, during which tens of millions of people were murdered by their own governments in the name of neo-Marxism and ideas that can be traced back to Marx or to critical theory. How many people were killed by their own communist governments in the 20th century, Dennis Prager?
Vietnam, 1 million. Eastern Europe, 1 million. Ethiopia, 1.5 million. North Korea, 2 million. Cambodia, 2 million. The Soviet Union, 20 million. China, 65 million. And the numbers are conservative. And of course, these numbers do not describe the suffering endured by hundreds of millions of people who were not murdered.
Thank you, PragerU. So, none of what I thought was just my nicer, kinder, smarter, fairer view of the world happened by accident. It was taught to me. And actually, there was nothing nice, kind, or fair about it. And it's definitely not smarter. Leftism is actually the ideology of the dumb and the naive. And now it's surging again. But this time it seems the culture is noticing it and calling it out. It's been branded, which is a good start. We now call it woke culture. We know that it's fundamentally wrong. It goes against thousands of years of thinking and philosophy and evolution. And it goes against human nature and common sense, and people can feel it even if they don't fully understand its roots intellectually. I'm optimistic. I think it will die out. The problem is, how much damage is it going to do before it does? Many bad actors are happy to use woke culture to achieve their political and personal power objectives and business success. But we believe the main power it has comes from ignorance. Ignorance about where all our traditional Western civilization's rules and ways of operating came from, especially ideas about money and economics. And that is why I started The Other Side. Australia's billion-dollar-plus taxpayer-funded national broadcaster is steeped in critical theory ideology. Almost every news story on the ABC implies in its subtext that, quote, the government should do something to fix it, unquote, whatever the it happens to be in any particular news story. The government should do something to fix it. It sounds nice. The idea that if government would just take more money from the economy and stick it into problems, then the problems would go away. But they almost never do. Funnily enough, when you stick money into something, it gets bigger. In recent weeks, we've seen some massive voting numbers for the Greens in elections around the country.
Today, we bring the people's protest into Parliament. Free, free Palestine!
Thank you, Senator Faruqi.
Ah, yes, the Greens. They are a socialist party and the main supporters of woke ideology in Australia. They average 10 to 20% in elections. But among young people and in the inner cities where a lot of the managerial, government and educated class live, their primary vote has been as high as 45% recently. This is serious, much more serious than a lot of people realise. 45% isn't to be sneezed at. It means that 1 in 2 people almost walked into the polling booth and put a 1 next to the Green candidate's name. And this happened in a Brisbane City Council election where the Green candidate had openly said that he supported shoplifting and squatting in empty homes.
If people are poor, they can't afford the rent, they're living below the poverty line, I think it is ethically justifiable.
That's anarchy, mate.
No, it is ethically justifiable.
That's anarchy. No wonder you're an anarchist.
Let me finish. I think it is ethically justifiable if people who cannot afford to put food on the table, whose kids are going
Break the law.
hungry, shoplift.
That was their Lord Mayoral candidate for the Brisbane City Council election, Jonathan Sriranganathan, on Brisbane's Radio 4BC in October. So there they were, clearly articulated neo-Marxist ideas, and that still didn't put voters off. So you can't dismiss this as a one-off fluke. It's a trend. And it's not all, but a significant proportion of young people, Gen Y millennials mainly, many approaching their early 40s now, who do not seem to be growing out of lefty thinking like Gen X and most hippie boomers did as they grew up. We think this is because of the fact that with the retirement and passing of the World War II generation, the left-wing boomers of the 60s have now been in control of academia, schools, media, and a lot of the government for more than 20 years. What's scariest and most worrying of all is that their ideas are now infiltrating the world of capital, the business world, and making capital less free. Money used to be the way people could rebel. Quit work, go start a small business, prove your own ideas, push back against the man. But now big corporations through the HR and PR and marketing and compliance legal departments and outside consultants desperate for a buck have all embraced this woke ideology through ESG measurement. That's environment, social and governance. The social is the dangerous one. And DEI measurement. That's diversity, equity and inclusion. Ideas that are unashamedly rooted firmly in neo-Marxist critical theory. They're quite open about it and they're proud of it.
DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. That sounds nice and responsible. No wonder all big companies now require employees to get training in it.
Because we understand that racial and systemic bias have many causes, sources, and ways of showing up within each of us.
There's a whole industry now designed to cater to companies looking for a quick way to check that box. In the U.S. in 2020, DEI was a $3.4 billion industry.
All white people are racist.
Some trainings are just divisive and dumb.
I believe that white people are born into not being human.
This is extreme, I take it.
It is extreme, but it's becoming more of the norm.
These slides were shown at a Coca-Cola diversity training.
The thesis of this training was try to be less white. They're talking about arrogance and things like that. That is by no means a white thing. The point is to demonize the other side as much as possible.
That report from Stossel TV. So now big corporations are working with big government to squeeze out anyone who doesn't play the big game. If you don't sign up to DEI and ESG as a big company, you don't get any capital investment anymore. Good luck getting a loan from a big bank or being invested in by the big asset management firms, the big superannuation funds in Australia. They're even largely controlled by industry groups that are connected to unions. They aren't going to give you any of the money taken from taxpayers against their will as compulsory super contributions. So the big corporations must comply, which means they won't hire people who don't also comply. And woke, therefore, wins. Who suffers? The rebels, mainly small business people, entrepreneurs, the innovators, the very people that a capitalist society needs to survive and thrive. So this is why I say we are in crisis and we need to chat. Our culture is socialist and it's getting more so every election as the Greens vote creeps ever higher. We have no strong right-wing free market party. Labor has shifted even further left and bought into woke, and the Liberal Party is falling over itself to become more left-wing. They keep losing elections, and the dopes within the party keep saying, we aren't left-wing enough, that's why we're losing. Now they're kicking people out or keeping people out of the party who challenge that view. So the Liberal Party is now a centre-left political party and a complete lost cause. They haven't noticed the trends elsewhere in the world, even as close as New Zealand, where people are rewarding traditional conservative centre-right parties that fight back and go more right, not left, in response to this wave of leftist culture. So we really are in big trouble. The left have captured big business. They've captured the main right-wing political party. The big question is Australia in crisis, and how do we get out of it? And that is the focus of our discussion this week. It's time to go off the set.